Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here with us again for the next segment of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah programs. Uh, Mishnah in depth Bava Batra with Rabbi Nathaniel Helfgot. I think you guys have all been here before. So just again, briefly, we'd love if you could turn on your cameras and we could see your faces. But we do ask that you stay muted when you're not speaking. If you have a question, you're welcome to raise your hand or send that to me privately if you'd like me to pass it on. Or put it in the chat publicly if that's your preference. And you can follow along with the source sheet, which I will be putting in the chat. And if there's any problems or questions, please get in touch with me. I think other than that, we should be good to go. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Rabbi Helfgot. And
Erev Tov to everybody. I hope everyone's well and has heat tonight. It's cold here, and that's important. And of course, as I've said in the past, continue. Our thoughts are very much with Israel and what's going on in Israel and the Chatufim, and our learning should be for their zechut and protection, and for all of Am Yisrael and anybody who's innocent, who's in the way, who's harmed. Okay, so tonight I'd like to focus on chapter 3 and some of chapter 4 of Bava Batra. I know that if I'm not mistaken, the Mishnah Yomit is just started Perek Hey, from what I understand. For those who are following along Mishnah Yomit, they go very fast. It seems because a week passes. So if you do 2 mishnayot a day, that's 14 mishnayot. So they're already just started Perek Hey. So let's talk about Perek Gimel. As we mentioned the first week, Perek Gimel is really the end of this longer section, which started at the end of Masechet Bava Metzia, which is colloquially known as, Hilchot Shutafin, the laws of neighbors, not Shutafin in the sense of partners, but the laws of Shchenim and Shutafim, the laws of people who live next to each other, not just strangers who just encounter each other in the Reshut HaRabim and injure each other or something like that, but actually people who live with each other all the time, and therefore created in that is a special set of responsibilities, mutual responsibilities, which we talked about at length last week. This last chapter closes that circle and talks about the idea of the one, so to speak, one step further of when you're not really sure in the challenge, you're not really sure who owns a piece of property. You're not really sure who is your neighbor, who's not your neighbor, who has rights in this and who doesn't have rights, because this field at some point changed hands and there was some a little bit of some problematic. So this Perek Gimel, which begins Perek Gimel, let me see if we go back. So on the sheet that we looked at last week, there was this schematic, which I wanted to just go back to for a second. The third chapter of Bava Basra deals with four topics. Topic number 1 is what we call Cheskat Re'iyah, or Ra'aya, more correctly, Cheskat Ra'aya. Chazaka, again, in this context, means a sense of ownership, a chazaka, that you are embedded in the land and you have ownership. A chazaka, you own it. A chazaka. So that's called cheskat ra'aya, that you have a proof that you own it. It's not an act of kinyan, it's not an act of acquisition, but it's a proof that you've owned it all along on some level. The second part, which is very small, talks about cheskat kinyan, which refers to how you acquire land. The third part deals with what's called cheskat tashmishin, where it doesn't reflect acquiring land, but it affects acquiring rights to do something in somebody else's land. You can work there, you can share crop, whatever it is. And finally, the last part of Perek Gimel ends with, so to speak, concluding. We kind of go back to a kind of classical cases relating to responsibility of one neighbor to the other. So kind of we end where we began, and we'll get to that when we get to those mishnayot in the end. So let's stop the share there. So we basically have 4 units that we're going to look at tonight. Go back to this other share, the first share, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. So my Zoom and my share. Okay. So the first Mishnah in Perek Gimel focuses on Chezkat Batim. What are proofs that I'm holding that property, and it ends with, and it talks about the examples are Chezkat Batim, Borot, Shichin, Me'orot, Merchatzaot, and Shovachot. So it deals with how do I display that I am legitimately this land that I'm on. I'm not just a squatter, but I actually own this. In what way can I express my chazaka, my muchzakut, my control and ownership of this land? How do I demonstrate it? And it gives examples of batim, houses, borot, cisterns, shichim, which are, so to speak, little canals, me'arot, caves, merchatzayot, okay, baths, shovachot, nests, beit habadim u beit hashlachim. Beit habadim are places where I prepare wine, wine houses. V'chol shu oseh perot adir chezkatan shalosh shanim. The perek ends very similar in terms of language. The very last Mishnah, which in some editions is Mishnah Chet, in some editions it's Mishnah Yud Bet. So we'll go with the Mishnah Chet. So it ends with a similar language. Ein osin halal tachat reshut harabim. You shouldn't make a hollow space. Borot, shichin, ume'arot. So it started with borot, shichin, ume'arot, and it closes the circle using the same examples, borot, shichim, ume'arot, and it kind of uses the same language. So ein osin halal tachat reshut harabim. You shouldn't make hollow space under public domain, public area, because it'll undermine the stability. And and examples are borot, shichin, ume'arot. Rabbi Lezer matir kitei shetehei agala mehalechet tuna avanim. You can do it as long as an agala that carries rocks can still go there. And then it talks about when you build a wall, which is right on the border of the Reshut HaRabim, right on the border of the public domain, you have to make sure that that there aren't little jagged edges of the rocks sticking out, because when people go right up to your property and they're still in the public domain, they could get hurt by your little rocks that stick out. Ella imratza, but if you want to make a wall with these little kind of rocks that are not smooth, elim ratza kones letoch shalo umotzi. Then you have to bring your wall a couple of feet in to your property, and then you can do this, because at that point it's in your property fully. And if some guy from the Reshut HaRabim wants to continue, so to speak, if he goes and presses up against the wall, your wall, that's not your fault. He went farther than he really should have. And again, the language here is kones letoch shalo umotzi, which is very similar, as it notices here. Kones in the first Mishnah, when it described what you're supposed to do in the first or second Mishnah, depending on how you organize it. So Amar Bishma Bamed Varm B'stei Lavan B'stei Yilan Kanas et Tvuato. He gathered his tvua to his property, etc., etc. So again, it uses similar language. Kones letoch shalo, kanas et tvuato. You gathered. So again, linguistically, it's parallel. Also, at the end, lakach chatzer. But if you already bought a chatzer, uba zizin u ketotzriot. If you bought a chatzer and the chatzer had a wall that already had these little jagged stones sticking out, then we can assume harezu kechezkata. It's already Chezkata means that the original owner of the Chatzer, when he built it, the line going between his Chatzer and Reshut HaRabim must have already been established, and he already built it inside his own land, and you don't have to worry about it. Once again, you're closing with the same language. Chezkat kechezkata, borot ushichin, etc., etc. So Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Chet all close with all use similar language. Again, a kind of literary envelope to begin and end with the same language that we have. And again, here you can see a couple of other examples: anaphoria, apophoria. Perek Gimel started, the Perek Bet started with Lo Yachpor Adam or Adan Bor Lo Sheach L'Mara. The beginning of Perek Gimel starts Cheskat Batim Borot Shachim Orot. The end of Perek Gimel ended Ilan Shunotel Reshut HaRabim Kotzeitz Kedei She'eh Gamal Uver Berochvo. If there's an Ilan, if there's a tree overhanging the public domain, you have to cut down that overhang so that a camel can come through it as somebody is on top of the camel. And here too, the last Mishnah of Perek Gimel ends with a specific, so to speak, discussion of what you can do in Reshut HaRabim. Eino sin halal tachat Reshut HaRabim. And again, the examples, Kadesha Tehei Agala Mehalechet Te'una Avanim, so that an Agala of a wagon that is, weighted down with stones can go through. And finally, the beginning of Perek Aleph of Bava Batra starts with Shutafin Sheratzu Lasot Mechitza B'Chatzer, and the last part begins, the very last part of the second to last Mishnah in Bava Batra, Perek Gimel, starts with Lo Yiftach Adam Michalotov L'Chatzer HaShutfin, just like the Shutafim Sheratzu Lasot Mechitza, and just like in the beginning of Perek Aleph, Ela Imratza Kones L'Toch Shalo, you can build the wall amongst yourself. Ela Imratza Kones L'Toch Shalo. So clearly, you have the same language at the beginning, at the end. You have language, again, in the beginning of the Perek Gimel and the end of Perek Gimel, the beginning of Perek Bet and Perek Gimel, and all the way from the beginning of Perek Aleph to the beginning of Perek Gimel, the end of Perek Aleph to the end of Perek Gimel. This closes the unit of Hilchot Shchenim, the laws of Shchenim. I want to spend a couple of minutes, maybe more than a few minutes, discussing the whole notion around of chazaka, chezkat re'iyah or chezkat ra'ayah. The chazaka which dominates basically up until this Mishnah, the Mishnah here, up until the end of Mishnah Hay. In Mishnah Hay, we're talking about what's called a machzik. The machzik, the person who is now on the ground and says that it is his land. Now, just to frame it, what are we talking about? We're not talking about land that is hefker. We're not talking about land that nobody has any claim to, that there's no written records about, that nobody ever lived there. We're not talking about no man's land. We're talking about land where we have what's called in halachic terminology the marikama. We have the marikama. We have the original owner who was known, okay? Ruvain was known. For 10 years, this field was known as Ruvain's land. And everybody knew it, and everybody knew. Now, it's a couple of years after, it's 12, 13 years later. And now Shimon is living on the land. And Shimon claims, yes, of course it was Ruvain's land for 10 years. However, he sold it to me. He gave it to me. I legitimately purchased it, or I legitimately acquired it. So, and Ruvain says, no, that's not what happened. I never heard of it. I never sold it. Maybe I disappeared for a couple of months or a couple of years, but I never did this. You're a squatter. Okay? That's the case that we're talking about here. So what happens if this goes on for a while? So the Mishnah presents a principle. Says the Mishnah, Cheskat batim borot shichim me'arot merchatzaot shovachot beit habadim beit hashlachim, all these different things, including avadim, slaves, avadim knanim, non-Jewish slaves, which are halachically compared to karka, to land. V'chol shu oseh perot tadir. And any land, so we talked about houses, we talked about cisterns, we talked about caves. These are all things that don't produce fruit. These are just things that are used. Beit habadim. V'chol shu oseh perot tadir. And anything that produces fruit on a regular basis, meaning they don't have a very fixed time of the year that they produce, but they constantly produce. Chezkatan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. They're chazaka. For the person who's now living on the land, for him to be able to maintain ownership, ba'alut, on this piece of land, on this beit habadim, on this house, on this cistern, he has to have been there 3 years, miyom liyom, from day to day, which means people have had to have seen him on that land from October 2021 till at least October 2024. He has to have been there at least 3 years. If he's there less than 3 years, his chazaka is not valid. It does not overcome the marikama, the original owner's claim, unless obviously you have a shtar. If you have a shtar, if you have a document, so that ends the discussion. We're obviously talking about a situation where there's no documentation. There's no documentation, and there's no witnesses that can explicitly tell us what happened. The only witnesses are that this guy has been living here for a couple of years, but there's no witnesses that can testify that, oh, I saw him give this land, they had a handshake on it, or I have a document, a shtar, that has 2 witnesses on it that tell a story. There's no document. Now, why does it work? Why does this chazaka work? So here, the Mishnah is silent. Mishnah is silent. Does not discuss why this works. So I would like to look at the Gemara on this, the Bavli, on this sugya, and basically, we want to look at, the Gemara says, on Daf Chavchet, and let's take a look at the Gemara on this. So the first explanation, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shamati miholchei Usha. I heard from the people who used to travel to Usha, back and forth. Shayu omrim, minaim lechazaka shalosh shanim. How do we know that this chazaka requires 3 years? So the Gemara makes a very strange comparison. Mishor hamuad, from shor hamuad. Shor hamuad, of course, is the category in the Torah. If my ox gores your ox, so it is liable for a certain amount of money. The halacha is that if it's the first time that this ox has gored, it's only liable for half the damage. Chatzi nezek, what's called in halacha, half the damage. That's a shor tam. It's a plain shor. I have no indication that it was a nagchan, that it was a goring ox. However, if it gores 3 times, that's a chazaka. That tells you either that now formally we treat it as a shor hamuad, that it's now, it has clearly its inclination is to gore, or it tells you all along this was a goring ox. You just didn't discover it. It tells you that this is something inherent in this ox. So the Gemara says, we learned this principle from Shor HaMuad. Ma Shor HaMuad, Kevan Shenagach Shalosh Negichot, Nafkale Michez Katam. Just as with a shor, when it strikes 3 times, it leaves the status, the chazaka, of being a shor tam, of being a plain shor, the kamle b'chezkat muad, and it enters into the realm of being, it has the status, it's a chazaka, its default status is now a muad. Hachanami here too. Kevan da'achla tlat shnin, once a man eats the peyrot of 3 years on this land, nafak le mirshut mocher, it has left the control of the mocher, of the seller, the original owner, v'kaimale bereshut lekucha, bereshut lokeach. So this is the Gemara's first explanation. So the Gemara's first explanation is very, very very eye-popping. It sounds almost like a weird kind of analogy. Shor HaMuad, I understand. After 3 times, it's indicative that this was not a fluke, that this, was spooked by something, but that inherently this is a very dangerous animal. This is an animal that is wanton to hurt other animals and property, and therefore it should be held, the Baal, the owner, should be held reliable at the highest level of liability, and therefore he's liable for everything that the shor has done. So 3 tells you that it wasn't a fluke or twice. It tells you that this is a bit, but applying that here seems very, very strange. Meaning, is it some sort of, I don't know, it's just weird. It's just weird. And it sounds like it's some sort of formalistic comparison. In fact, Tosfot on the page is so troubled by this that he throws in a line. He says, Milta below tamahi. Has no real reason. It's not a really convincing explanation. Okay? And therefore, it's not really, etc. Okay. Now it's very, very, very difficult to understand this, but that's the first suggestion. On the other hand, the Gemara on the second part, the second page of this Gemara, the Gemara raises a different approach. And this is the approach of Rava. Rava, without going into the whole Gemara, the Gemara says, no, what's going on here? Ela Amar Rava, right here, this line. Shata Kamaita. The reason why 3 years works is because, the first Shata Kamaita, the first year, when you're on the land, Mizdahir Inish Bishtari. A person holds on to the shtar, meaning Rava assumes that this was, if we want to believe the person who's living on the land, it means that probably there was a legitimate sale with a shtar, because no person would want to go onto land without having a document, a deed, because he doesn't want to be kicked off and claim, that you're just a squatter. So the first year, people hold on to their shtar. Tarte v'tzlat mizdaher. People hold on and are careful the second and the third year. Tefei lo mizdaher. But after 3 years, people generally don't, once nobody's come at the door and knocked and checked to see my papers, at a certain point, I give up. It reminds me very much of US, at least they used to. I don't know. Today, everything's electronic, so it doesn't matter. But when you actually had to fill out tax forms And so the accountants would tell you, you should keep your taxes for 7 years, right? That's what they used to, I don't know, 10 years, 7 years, I don't know, whatever they used to tell you. Because after that, a person can't be expected to hold on to their forms for that long. It's not fair. After that long, you can't be expected. And so therefore, if someone comes to you and says, hey, this is my land, and you say to them, yeah, but you sold it to me 10 years ago, and you say, prove it, and the guy says, prove it, what do you mean I sold it? Show me your star. You can say back to them, I held on to it for a while, but after a while, no one came, no one was mochet, to use the language of the Gemara, no one challenged my domicile on this land, or my use of this land, or my use of the cistern. So therefore, it was fine. That's what seems to be emerging from the Gemara. But it's still, that's what the Gemara will later call achve shtare. Before 3 years, the person who was the original owner can say, show me your document. And if you can't produce the document, that shows that your chazaka on this land, your living on this land is very weak and doesn't stand up against my original ownership of this land, which everybody agrees to, that I own this land for 10 years or whatever, or 10, 20 years. But you still have to go a little bit deeper. What is this chazaka? I mean, what is it based on? So here the Rishonim they weren't happy with simply saying, oh, after 3 years, it's a sort of magical 3 years. After 3 years, people get rid of their shtar, and therefore now you have a chazaka. I mean, what happens? 3 years now creates a chazaka? There has to be something more going on here. And therefore, many Rishonim, take it in one of two directions to understand what's going on. One direction is to basically say that what's really at the heart of what establishes your chazaka is not the fact that that the shtar doesn't have to be around for more than 3 years. That's not what establishes. What establishes the chazaka is what's called in Hebrew girui ushtika. Girui means a provocation and the lack of any response. Meaning, this guy has been living on your property. If it's really, really your property, this guy has been living on your property, harvesting the fruits, using the water. He's been doing these very provocative acts which demonstrate control of the property, which show him to be the balabas, show him to be the owner. And yet you stood by and said nothing for 3 years. Later on, there's a Mishnah that actually will say that it's connected to the fact that 3 years is kind of the outside limit of how far in their society people lived from each other and were able to get news and come back about what's happening in their hometown. To live in the farthest reaches of the world, so it might take a year for the person to travel, for a year for the guy to be there. And then people would start traveling and the news would travel a year, and then it would take a year to come back and challenge. If you don't come back within 3 years, this is the notion of girui v'shtika, of provocation and silence. If you didn't respond, then that's okay. Now, if that's at the core of this business of what 3 years is about, so then technically, and this Rishonim actually say explicitly, that it may be that You don't always need 3 years. It depends on the level of provocation. 3 years is the kind of standard. If somebody lives on my land in that society, somebody lived on my land and for a couple of months, couple of years, okay, for the first few weeks, first few months, I didn't say anything. If I didn't say anything after 3 years, that shows you that obviously I wasn't bothered by it. And it probably indicates that there had been a legal sale sometime in the process in the past, which means, but that's only when someone is kind of just really living on your land. They're taking a little bit of fruit here and there. They're showing up every once in a while in their pickup and doing, their farming there. But it's not an egregious thing. But if, let's say, somebody comes to the land that you ostensibly still own, and they start tearing down everything that's there. They tear down the barn. They tear down, and they start building, as the song goes, they tore paradise down and they built up a parking lot. And they built a parking lot there, right? So ostensibly, even less than 3 years, if you don't react immediately, that's indicative of the fact that probably this person has a right to do what they're doing. And so in this situation, it's pretty clear that the question that's at, is what's called girui v'shtika. And that's at the heart of it. The 3 years with the shtar is just a statement indicative of that. That after 3 years, a person gets rid of the shtar because they've done, in the normal course of events, enough things to provoke the wrath of the original owner, and yet he didn't do anything. That shows you that really this land is really his. So that's one way to understand this. The second way to understand this Mishnah is to understand it as what's called, is to understand it as what we call muchzakut. Muchzakut is just a technical phrase for how exactly do you, it's not so much about the provocation element. Yeah, that's not the core. The core is, how does one establish that really how is indicative of the fact that this is really mine? Okay, let's say it's a cup. This cup, which we know was once owned by Ruvain. Everybody agrees it was once owned. And now I'm holding the cup. I don't need 3 years to establish my muchzakut, the fact that I am the owner. I'm not buying the cup at this moment, but I'm showing my muchzakut. Not because I am provoking him and he doesn't react. That's not simply when it comes to a cup, the very fact that I'm owning it, that I'm holding it and I'm drinking from it, I have total control over it. That's indicative that I'm really the owner. Okay? It's just indicative. That's called muchzakut. Okay? Okay? When it comes to land, obviously, I can't hold land. I can't show my total control in the way that when I pick up a cup, I am holding it, I am moving it from place to place. Karka, land, can't be moved from one place. I can't pick up the land and move it from one place to place. That's why Chazal, for example, very famously always say, Karka eina nigzelet. You can't steal land in the classical sense of stealing. Yes, you can come and use persons, but you can't steal it in the sense of picking it up and taking it somewhere else. So how do we say, how do you create muchzakut? How do you create that sense that you're really demonstrating that you're the one who's in charge here? So the only way you can do that by karka is by an ongoing, right? Because with land, I can't pick it up and in this 1 second show, I'm the one who's in charge. I have to ongoingly come and do things on this land. I have to come and farm it. I have to come and trim it. I have to come and check it. I have to come and see all those things that are reflective of the fact that I am in control. Okay, and that's exactly the way it's formulated in some of the Rishonim. Okay. Again, if you look, for example, if you look in the Rambam, for example, Rambam in Helfgot To'en V'Nit'an, he formulates it in the context of what again I called provocation and lack of response. Rambam says, why do we say that this works? Mipnei she'omrim lo l'Shimon. We say to Shimon, the fellow who owns the original owner, Im emet ata to'en shelo macharta v'lo natata. If your claim is correct, that you never sold your original holding and you never gave it away, lama haya hu ze mishtamesh shana achar shana bekarkecha v'lo machita bo. Why did this person use it year after year and you didn't respond? So that's the classic provocation, lack of response. Okay? But again, it's not the fact. This is the what you may call it. This is the language of the Rambam. On the other hand, the language of other Rishonim is not about that. The other Rishonim is again the Ritva and others say ke'ein shehatfisa raya b'metaltalin. Listen to that comparison. Just like when it comes to movables, like a cup, 3 years is like, it's equivalent to holding by metaltalin. Again, the very fact that I'm using the land displays the fact that I'm muchzak. And that's what it really means when it says after 3 years you don't have to show the shtar. It's because your very presence there is enough of a raya to show your muchzakut, your sense of being there without necessarily holding on to the shtar. Okay. So that we spent a little bit of time on this Mishnah. I want to spend time on another Mishnah in Perek Gimel, and then we'll move to Perek Dalet. Okay? We only have so much time. We could spend, hours and hours on each Mishnah. Mishnah Gimel. Mishnah Gimel has a fascinating statement. Okay? Mishnah Gimel says as follows. Kol chazaka she'ein ima ta'ana eina chazaka. So when Shimon comes to me, I'm living on this land for 3 years, and I'm working the land occasionally, whatever I'm doing. And if Shimon comes to me and challenges me, and I say, you know what? He says to me, oh, what are you doing on my land? And I say, well, you sold it to me. You gave it to me. That is a chazaka im ta'ana. You have a chazaka. You are default on the land. You own the land. You've displayed your being on the land together with a claim explaining why you are the legitimate rightful owner of the land currently. However, says the Mishnah, Kol chazaka she'eni matana eina chazaka. But if you have no claim why you are legitimately the owner. For example, Amar lo ma'ata oseh b'toch shali. If Shimon came to Reuven and said, what are you doing in my property? And he responds, Shalo amar li adam davar. Nobody ever said anything to me. He does not claim that Shimon sold it to him, or that Shimon gave it to him, or that Shimon never owned it. He just says, I just sat there. Nobody said anything to me. That's not a chazaka. However, shemachartali, you sold it to me. Shenatatali matana, harezu chazaka. V'haba mishum yerusha eino tzarich ta'ana. But when you are claiming that this was inherited, that's a whole different ballgame. You don't require a ta'ana. So this is a fascinating this thing. This is a fascinating idea of chazaka she'ein ima ta'ana. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper into this concept. What does it mean, chazaka she'ein ima ta'ana, works? Why does what's the chiddush, so to speak, right? Because the Gemara will ask on this. The Gemara actually asks, isn't this obvious? Obviously, if you don't make any claim, you have no standing. The Gemara asked this question in Bava Batra, right on this Mishnah. And the Gemara's response is as follows. The Gemara says, that the reason why, we might have thought that the reason why he doesn't say anything is because that you sold it to me or you lent it to me, or you gave it to me, is because he doesn't want to have to be put on the spot that he has to produce a shtar. And he doesn't have the shtar. So that's the reason why he didn't say it. And I might have thought that we, the Beit Din, provide the ta'ana in his place, provide his claim in his place. Says the Gemara, no, we do not do that. Now, it's still a very strange, and all the Rishonim ask, all the medieval comments, it's still very strange. What do you mean? That's the chiddush? That's also an obvious thing. Obviously, if this person doesn't express a ta'ana, why should we put these words in his mouth in such a difficult situation? Okay. And therefore, the Gemara also, before in the Sugya, the Gemara actually asks, if we accept the argument of Holchei Usha that I started tonight with, that we compare it to Shor HaMuad, simply formalistically, the fact that three times, just like the Shor HaMuad, the goring ox becomes a goring ox when three events happen. So arbitrarily we say 3 years is the cutoff. 3 years, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years is arbitrarily. The Gemara actually asks, if that's true, why do we even need a ta'ana at all? Also, chazaka sheni matana should be a chazaka. It sounds like something else is going on here. And so to answer this, I want to look at some other Rishonim. Okay, so take a look. And this is based on the teachings that I heard from I learned from my great teacher, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, on chazaka she'eni matana. Remember when I presented at the beginning, what is the fellow, the original fellow comes, and it's known to us that he was the original owner. Now, I didn't go into, right? Shimon comes to Reuven and says, what are you doing on my land? And everybody knows that at some point Shimon was the owner. That's a given. Now, how does everybody know that Shimon was the owner? Ostensibly because everybody knows. But how does everybody know? Ostensibly because either he had a document that clearly indicates that this was his land, or there were witnesses that indicated, yeah, we know that it was well known in this city that Shimon's father owned this land and he inherited it from Shimon's father, all these things. What happens in a case where he has no edim to indicate that this was his original plot of land? So the Mordechai, one of the great Ashkenazi Rishonim, one of the three major Talmidim, students of the Maharam of Rothenburg, the pillar of Ashkenazic Psak Halacha in the Middle Ages. He had three students. One of them was the Mordechai. So the Mordechai writes as follows. Kol chazaka she'eni ma ta'ana eina chazaka. Rabbeinu Yakar, having mistapik. Rabbeinu Yakar had the following question, doubt. Man delet le shum edut yadua bekarka. So let's say someone has no testimony that indicates, and nothing that indicates that he was the original marikama. He was the original owner of this field. Ume'arer al chaveiro. And now comes to Reuven and says, why are you sitting on my land? How come you've been here for 2.5 years? What are you doing? V'amar le amata oseh betoch shali. What are you doing in my property? V'amar le hamachazik, and the person who now is sitting on the land, shalo amar li shum adam me'olam shum davar. And once again, he does not have a ta'ana. He does not have a ta'ana. He just says, no one ever said anything to me. Umiu lo eitzei avurecha, but I'm not going to leave the land ad shetivarer be'edim she'i shalcha, until you produce witnesses that it was really yours. Mi matzi l'siluke mina karka olo. Can he remove the current inhabitant of the land or not? Or does the current inhabitant have such, even though he doesn't have a ta'ana, the current inhabitant is able to say to him, you have no standing because you have no eidim that prove that you were the original owner. And since you don't have a standing to prove that you were the original owner, I'm not going to get off this land. So the Mordechai actually quotes that there were rabbis who accepted this argument of the person living on the land. The Katav Rashbat, the Ta'ana Nechonahi. The Rashbat, one of the Rishonim, in Hachanami said that in that situation, even if the person living on the land, the squatter, if you want to call him, living on the land, has no ta'ana, he would be believed. However, many Rishonim disagree. And many Rishonim say that's exactly, so to speak, on some level, the chiddush of the Mishnah. The chiddush of the Mishnah is that if you don't have a ta'ana, you know what? Even your chazakah, as long as you don't have a ta'ana, your chazakah is worthless, even when the claim of the original owner is very weak and he doesn't have eidim. Take a look at Rambam. Rambam says as follows, and he's willing to accept. He's willing to accept that the Rambam is the one who says that in that instance you would not listen to the just like this Rashbatz, you would not listen to the me'arer, to the person who's challenging the fellow who's living on the land. Let's read the Rambam. Rambam writes, Kol chazaka in Hilchot To'in v'nit'an, Perek Yudalet Halacha Yudbet, Kol chazaka she'eni matanaina chazaka. If you claim that you are the legitimate owner of this land because you've been living here for almost 3 years, but you don't claim anything, Eina chazaka. Ketzad harei shachal perot tzadeh zu kama shanim. If you ate the fruit of this land for a number of years, Uba me'arer v'amalo, and the person came and challenged, Me'ayin lecha sadezu shalihi, it's mine. Heshivu v'amar eno yodea shalmihu, I don't know who it was. Became shalomar li adam, and since nobody ever said to me, stay out, I went in. Ein zu chazaka shaharei lo ta'an shelekacha v'lo shnitna lo v'lo shiarsha, because he didn't claim that he bought it or he was given it. Afal pi shelo ta'an. However, Rambam says, even though he does not have a ta'ana, ein motzino to miyado ad she'avizeh me'arer eidim shehi shelo. Rambam claims the me'arer, the original marekama, the original owner, has to be able to produce witnesses that it was once him. Hevi eidim tachzir lo asadeh. If he is able to produce witnesses that he was the original owner, he gets back the field, and we give him back all the peirot. Okay? So Rambam is of the opinion that a chazakah she'eni ma ta'ana against a marikama, against an original owner who has no witnesses, would work. However, Meiri disagrees. Meiri writes, "V'katvu gdolei hamechabrim she'af al pi shelo ta'an aleha ein motzino tom yado ad she'avi ze amerer edim shishalo." Gdolei hamechabrim is Rambam. Rambam claims that even though he did not have a ta'ana, he didn't have a claim, ein motzino tom yado, we don't take it away from him until he brings witnesses. The Yesh Cholkim, says the Meiri, there are those who disagree, Lomar, Shemei Achar Shezeh Ba B'Ta'anot, Ta'anat Avot, Bibaria, V'Hala Modeh, She'lo Haya Shelo, Notlim Lo Me'arer. Basically, he claims that no, even in this instance, it's a chazaka she'ein ima ta'ana. Since this person has no argumentation why he's on the land, he just says, nobody ever told me not to come on the land. Even though the person challenging him and says, give me back my land, he has no witnesses. Since his tana is what's called bari, he has what's called bari, it's definitely mine. And the other one has no ta'ana bari. He's a shema. Maybe it was mine. Maybe no one ever said anything to me. In that situation, halachically, it is his, and he's able to take it back. And that's a chazaka she'eni matana, even in this kind of a case. So that's one chiddush of this Mishnah. Another potential chiddush of this Mishnah is based on the claim of Tosafot. Tosafot, in the beginning of the Masechta, introduces another theme. Tosafot says, Chazaka she'ein imatana would be as follows. As follows. I might think, says Tosafot, if you look at the last line, he says, Ubelo ta'ana nami teishalo. Di'itlan lemeimar shemachalo. I might have thought that if there's mechila, I might have thought chazaka she'eni matana would work, because the fact that he didn't step in for the last 3 years and stop this guy from doing whatever he's doing, that's indicative of what we call in halacha mechila. Mechila means that even though it's mine, I gave up on it. I was mochel to him. I said, you can keep it. And I might have thought that this is reflective of the idea of mechila. And that's what the chiddush of the Mishnah is. Okay. We have to stop here. Next week, I'll do a couple of comments on chapter 4 of Bava Batra, and then we'll do chapter 5 and maybe even some of chapter 6 so that we catch up, because we have 3 more sessions, December 2nd, December 9th, and December 16th. The 3 more sessions, we're going to cover whatever we cover. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. As usual, we've got so many wonderful classes ongoing and upcoming. So please check those out at drisha.org/classes. And thank you so much, Rabbi Helfgot. See you all soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.